What should we do? A lot of people have been wondering lately if science can tell us that. That leads right into morality and politics. Sam Harris is leading that. His book, The Moral Landscape, is about the idea of secularism as a basis for morality. His first book, The End of Faith, posed the problem of how to make secularism a cohesive enough body of ideas to defeat religious fundamentalism as a political force. There are a few points we can sketch in right away. First, a political or moral ideology is a set of ideas about what people should do. A lot of people say that science is politically neutral, so it can't tell us anything about what we should do. But that isn't true. There are some assumptions about what people should do that are implicit to science. People should search for reliable information. They should search for information that is observable, universal, self-consistent, reproducible, and debatable. There is the argument that we shouldn't think about what we should do because we already know that whoever has the most physical force on their side is going to get what they want. However, the fact that we have evolved the ability to think about what we should do indicates that people who thought about what they should do had a higher survival rate than people who didn't think about what they should do. So I think we should keep thinking about what we should do, and a lot of people agree with that. Since the people with the most force on their side are the ones who get what they want, after we decide what we want, we just have to make sure that the force that makes that stuff happen is a more powerful force than the force that makes something else happen. That's why we have laws against murder, for instance, instead of just having strong opinions about murder, but then leaving the choice up to individuals to make for themselves. Then there's the argument that you can't derive ought from is. That's true, but you can derive will from is. We ought to attempt to preserve the survival rates of our genes by the most effective means perceivable to us because we will do that anyway, whether we recognize it or not. War is not very compatible with secularism. Secularism depends on debate, and a war isn't a debate. A war is the attempt to physically eliminate the ability of another group of people to oppose you. That's great if you're fighting in self-defense, but that's as far as it goes. Any other time, it's a lot easier to kill people when you believe they're automatically inferior to you and that you have the creator of the universe on your side. War is a situation that religious fundamentalists will always be better at than atheists. So, if we want to win, we better think of something else. Now, I can imagine that people making the argument that an atheist intellectual elite could outsmart all the religious people and somehow manipulate them. But as Avros told us last semester, they have secular revolutions in the Middle East all the time and they never work. The secularists always have to get a bunch of religious people on their side in order for the political movements to get strong enough to win. Then you have a political movement that defeats its enemies and is made up mostly of religious people. Then the religious people want to decide what happens because they do make up most of the political movement. So the religious people take over the secular political movement from the inside, and then everything is pretty much right back to where it started. Secularism fits perfectly with the right to free speech, to an education, and to dissent. Secularism depends on debate, so the more diversity you have in your society, the more debate you get. Also, the more diversity you have, the more ideas you have to draw upon to adapt to changing situations. In biology, the term for strength through diversity is robust. Another of Dr. Harris's main points in The End of Faith was that we are not debating in a vacuum. A big reason the Christian fundamentalist political movement took so many people by surprise is because people so underestimated just how insane a well-dressed adults could be. For instance, if a nuclear war started right this minute, I think everyone in this room would consider that to be bad. But a lot of Christian fundamentalists see the Battle of Armageddon as the path to the eternal salvation of their souls, which means they see total global destruction as the best thing that could ever happen to them. Now we can expand on what Dr. Harris said here. The problem isn't actually religion. The problem is people making their decisions based on ideas that don't match reality. Now let's pull on that thread a little more. A lot of people who oppose atheism say that they tried combining atheism and politics in the Soviet Union, and look what happened. But that's not really a valid argument, because the Soviet Union was never an atheistic political system in practice. Atheism depends on debate, and the KGB abducting political dissidents in the middle of the night isn't debate. So that's a failure of atheism, even if nobody involved actually believed in gods. A totalitarian political system is one that tries to force people to accept the government as the absolute truth. But that can never work, because a government is founded by people, and people make mistakes. It is a historical fact that the theory of evolution was published in 1859. The first two laws of thermodynamics, which are the foundation of physics, were discovered in 1868. Since these discoveries were made, they've led to a lot of further discoveries in things like environmental science, economics, and human psychology. But the Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. That means it was written by people who had no way of knowing the most fundamental laws of physics or biology. That means it was founded on ideas that didn't match reality. It doesn't matter what the plan for the Soviet Union was. We don't need to look any further than this to see that whatever the plan was, it was not going to work, because it was based on ideas that didn't match reality. Now that's a good place to start studying the history of the Soviet Union and what went wrong for them. Whatever the communist plan was, it's a safe bet that it wasn't to create a political system that would collapse in just 70 years. Anybody want to tell me what year the U.S. Constitution was written? 1787, or somewhere around 1789. Anyway, meaning before 1859. So that's a big clue that we might have a problem here too. As a lot of environmental scientists have been saying amongst themselves for a long time, if we pit the Constitution against the laws of physics are going to win. More generally, if we pit the U.S. political system against scientific laws, the scientific laws are going to win. Even if there isn't a problem within the Constitution itself, the fact remains that people spent most of a century writing laws based on ideas that didn't match reality. And even more importantly, today about 3/4 of the population of the U.S. still doesn't believe in evolution. Now we keep voting for politicians, and the politicians' plans keep not working. And a lot of people can't figure out why. Speaking of atheism and the Soviet Union, Ayn Rand is another popular atheist philosopher who had a lot to say about politics. She was born in Russia in 1905. She lived through the revolution, and then she immigrated to the U.S. in 1926. That makes her one of a fairly small number of people in the world who lived under monarchy, communism, and capitalism. Now her novel Atlas Shrugged is being turned into a movie trilogy. I've read her books The Fountainhead, We the Living, and Anthem. One of the main philosophical points of her books is the difference between individualism and collectivism, and how those lead to different political philosophies. Dr. Susan Blackmore, who pioneered the field of mimetic evolution with her book The Meme Machine, made a parallel discovery more recently from the direction of evolutionary psychology. There are two ways people can develop new ideas: origination or imitation. Origination means thinking up new ideas on your own. Imitation means copying ideas other people have thought of. So this is the basic pattern I discovered, where individualists originate and collectivists imitate. The critical difference here is that everyone does some of both. Some people do more of one and other people do more of the other, but these aren't two separate categories of people. With the exception of children whose parents lock them in their basements all their lives, everyone learns a lot by imitating other people. Ayn's philosophy is a big inspiration to a lot of capitalists. A lot of capitalists say that the profit motive drives innovation. Then they equate that with individualism. But there are a few problems with that. Ayn's work is also a big inspiration to a lot of artists. The problem with the capitalist interpretation of her work is playing out in the Phoenix Art District right now, and is always happening at some stage in every art district in every city. First of all, a political philosophy whose adherents all chant individualism, individualism, individualism isn't individualism anymore. That's just a new form of collectivism. That happens with every political philosophy. Every political or social movement starts with some idealistic people who try to make their society different from what it is now. They develop a body of ideas to try to reach their long-term goals. When they act upon their ideas, they change their situation. That creates opportunities that other people see they can take advantage of. So more people get involved, and they help to change the situation from what it was originally, but not in the same way the people who started the social movement were trying to change it. Art districts get created because some artists move into a rundown neighborhood with low rents and set up studios. They do most of the work themselves, fixing up their buildings and dealing with all the crack dealers, pimps, muggers, and homeless people in the neighborhood. They invest basically all the money they have into it. They do all of this because it gives them the chance to create the art they want. Once these pioneer artists get the art district established, it's easier for more people to move into the neighborhood and set up art galleries, or to set up businesses related to art galleries, like restaurants and bars. That makes the property values start to rise. Eventually, the property values rise so far that the original type of artist can't afford to stay there anymore. But by that point, a lot of the pioneer artists don't want to stay in the neighborhood anymore anyway, because it's not really an art district anymore. It's turned into a shopping mall. So the pioneer artists move off to a neighborhood they can afford, and the process repeats. The worst part about this, from the pioneer artist's point of view, is that the people who move into the art district they created usually don't see how hard they had to work to create the art district in the first place. Those people usually try to take all the credit for creating the art district themselves because they came along with all their money and invested it into stuff, and now look how wonderful the neighborhood is. But the only reason there was ever an art district there for them to invest their money into in the first place was because so many artists were willing to work so hard without getting paid. Everyone here is motivated by profits. The people in the second wave are motivated by financial profits. The pioneers measure their profits in the opportunity to do what they love. Ayn didn't distinguish very well between the two. A lot of her individualist followers don't seem to make the distinction at all. The problem is that Ayn said capitalism is what makes this whole thing possible, and that makes capitalism better than either monarchy or communism. What she meant was political self-determination through economic self-determination. The pioneering wave of artists are capitalists in the sense that they used their resources they controlled in the way they saw fit and produced what they wanted to produce. But they're not capitalists in the sense that their goal was to make as much money as possible. That is the goal of the second wave that moves into the art district. So these two groups of people have goals that overlap in some ways and conflict with each other in other ways. Now this brings me to a big reason so much political debate is so unproductive. Every social or political movement has two parts to it: the idealism phase and the practicality phase. When you talk about whether a political system works or not, are you talking about the ideals behind the political system, or are you talking about the ideals being put into practice? The failure of the Soviet Union is a very good example of this. Lenin was shot in the neck in an assassination attempt in 1918. He survived it, but his health suffered after that. He died in 1923 at the age of 53. That means he was only the leader of the Soviet Union for 6 years, the first 5 of which were taken up with the revolution and the political upheavals it caused. So the world never got to see what Lenin was trying to do. All anyone ever saw was what Stalin did in the situation Lenin created. Lenin's plan wouldn't have worked anyway, but he never even got the chance to try to adapt it. We've seen the same thing here in the US. As I'm sure we've all heard, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin, and a lot of the other founding fathers were deists, which was a precursor to atheism. The fact that George W. Bush got George Washington's old job doesn't prove that he did what George Washington was trying to do. All that proves is that he figured out how to take advantage of the situation George Washington created. You need to be wise, competent, and a good leader to get people to join your revolution. But you don't need to be any of those things to get to be President of the United States now. All you have to do now is to get a sufficient number of votes to come out in your favor to win a one-vote majority in the Electoral College. If you're comparing the idealism of one ideology to the practice of another, like capitalism and socialism, you're not talking about the same things. If you then try to debate ideologies with someone who's doing the opposite of that, like comparing the ideology of socialism with the practice of capitalism, the two of you are accomplishing basically nothing. Every ideology seems like a good idea to the people who feel like they can win at it. I've never heard of anyone struggle for an ideology they felt would make things worse for themselves overall. So, if you're going to debate with someone which ideology is better than another, you ought to start by figuring out what each of you are talking about. Capitalism as individuals' use of resources in the way they think best isn't original. Every animal of every species does that. We didn't need an ideology to tell us that. As a philosophical discovery, that was a step away from religion and towards secularism, because that's the idea that individual people should make decisions instead of depending on some sort of king or organized religion to tell them what to do. But a lot of capitalists seem to lose sight of that and equate making money with accomplishing your goals in life. The people who make the most money are supposed to be the most successful. It is true that making more money than anyone else gives you the most control of resources and therefore the most decision-making power to apply toward your goals. But what if you're trying to do something that money can't buy? How many dollars is a healthy family worth? I was once engaged to a wealthy heiress who was also a reformed coke addict. Nobody in my family has ever had a trust fund. But then again, nobody in my family has ever been a coke addict either. There are some things in life you just can't substitute money for, and if you try, you'll throw some important things out of balance. There's a big difference between having control of resources and knowing how to apply resources toward the achievement of your goals. One last thing I want to say about individualism is that if you have a college degree in something or you're serious about getting one, you've already failed at individualism. Because if there's someone already waiting at the end of the education system to award you your degree in something, it means you're already following in someone else's footsteps. Charles Darwin didn't have a PhD in biology because he's the one who made the discovery that created the field of biology. For that matter, Jesus didn't have a PhD in theology.
Yes!
If you're so serious about individualism, why don't you drop out of college and invent your own field of study? That's what I did. And it worked pretty well for Bill Gates, too, another well-known atheist. Okay, so we can see that the general problems that have affected other people's political system are affecting ours too. So where do we look for a backup plan? The first problem we have to solve is finding a foundation for a political movement that people of diverse backgrounds will join voluntarily because they can understand it easily and they can see how to apply it toward their own situations. This isn't really hard. Every group of people is organized around the same structure. Most people just haven't noticed it. A lot of psychologists have been studying this. I figured this out on my own about 8 years ago. Some friends of mine and I were trying to set up a punk rock community theater company. We kept running into the same conflicts within our group. If the conflicts got bad enough, our groups would self-destruct. So I could see that in order to succeed at our goals of creating the art we wanted to create, we had to figure out how we, personally, could organize our group to keep conflicts from destroying it. A couple of years before, I'd heard some rumors about evolutionary philosophy from one of my cousins who was majoring in philosophy. I'd heard a lot of legends about Native American tribes and how they were organized. Most people in the US have heard about that stuff. 3 other of my cousins are Native Americans, so even though these seem like abstract ideas to a lot of people, they aren't to everybody. You start with a group of people living in the wilderness. Say there are 100 of them, just for a round number. Some of them are family groups, but not everyone is related to each other. The group is small enough that everyone knows everyone else personally. Everyone has individual interests, but everyone is trying to live in the same environment, so everyone has a lot of interests in common. They live together in a group so they can cooperate toward their mutual interests. The males compete against each other to attract females, just like every animal species does. That creates a hierarchy with the alpha male at the top. The females are the most attracted to the males highest up in the hierarchy because they're the ones who won the competitions against the most males. Mating with the males who were the most successful in the competitions is how females combine their genes with the healthiest genes in the group. Meanwhile, the females compete against each other for the attention of the males, and they form their own hierarchy, and that's how the males recognize the females with the best genes. So what does a male need to compete against other males? Strength and health are obvious. Intelligence is important too, to recognize how to apply your strength and health effectively. Human-level intelligence adds leadership as another factor. Since these are people who are trying to survive in the wilderness together, by proving you're the most successful at surviving, you make yourself someone other people want to cooperate with. If other people can see that you're the best at surviving in those living conditions, and that they would be better at surviving by doing what you say than they would be on their own, they can elevate you in the hierarchy just to benefit themselves. Then your efforts would produce greater output than anyone else's, so that makes you look like the alpha male to prospective mates. So now we're not talking about a mating hierarchy anymore. Now we're talking about the political structure of a tribe. In a group of hunter-gatherers, everyone makes the things they need directly from raw materials. There's division of labor among age groups and between genders, but within each of those groups, everyone knows how to do the same things. All the men have weapons, and all of them have access to the chief. That alone is enough to keep the chief from abusing his power, because any other man in the group could kill him and take over his job at any time. The chief stays the chief by continually proving that he would be better than anyone else as chief. Now add in agriculture. Now things get more complicated. Now you get division of labor because each farmer can support larger families and can produce more food than his family needs. Now you get higher population sizes. Now the group gets too big for everyone to know everyone else personally. You also get division of labor because some of the surplus food can be used to support people who specialize in other jobs. Now you get a leadership class because coordinating people's efforts becomes a full-time occupation. Now the chief becomes the king. He's still the alpha male because he's still the top of the hierarchy. Great kings are admired for their strength, health, intelligence, and leadership. They have way more decision-making power than anyone else now because they have been put into decision-making positions, and they have the skills to coordinate other people's efforts. They don't live among the people of the rest of the group anymore. They're still motivated by inherent self-interest, and now they don't need to get along well with everyone else. So now they can take some of the products of everyone else's labor, and they can invest that wealth into making themselves more powerful. So they surround themselves with palaces and armies so none of the other people can kill them easily anymore. Now you get inherited rulership. The kings want their sons to be as powerful as possible so they can carry on their bloodlines. The first generation of kings worked their way up from chief status by doing the chief job in different conditions. The following generations of kings are born into different living conditions than anyone else in the group lives in. The king position is given to them automatically. So now they don't have to be strong, healthy, intelligent, and great leaders. Now they can just use the opportunities their fathers created, command people to keep paying their taxes, and accumulate wealth and power that they never could have earned on their own. Eventually, you get to corrupt kings who have completely lost sight of how their kingdoms began and what it depended on. They get so wrapped up in their self-interest that their kingdom breaks down around them. Eventually, another male from another powerful family starts a revolution and overthrows the king. Capitalism began in England about 350 years ago. Basically, the merchant class figured out a way to circumvent the monarchy. By trading goods, they found another way to amass wealth. By increasing their economic self-determination, they increased their political self-determination. So the monarchy became an aristocracy. The founding fathers of the U.S. realized that they had the opportunity to try something new now that they were on another continent away from all the monarchies. A lot of European philosophers had thought about other ways to organize societies. Now a lot of the colonists met up with Native Americans who were applying the basic tribal structure to other living conditions, so they were doing some of the things the Enlightenment philosophers had been talking about. Forgotten Founders by Bruce Johansen is a book about how half of the U.S. Constitution is based on the great law of peace of the Haudenosaunee Nation, who white people usually refer to as the Iroquois Nation. I'd just like to point out here that the Haudenosaunee has never surrendered to the U.S. government. They've just had a really hard time reorganizing their country. They lived in the eastern Great Lakes area, but then some of their people were sent to live on reservations in Wisconsin and others on reservations in Oklahoma, and the U.S.-Canadian border was drawn right through the middle of their land. How do you politically organize your country when half your people have been relocated 1,000 miles away and your remaining lands are surrounded by two separate countries? So unfortunately, the Haudenosaunee Nation isn't represented in the United Nations. The Haudenosaunee Nation is a confederacy of 6 nations, the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, Tuscarora, and the Mohawks. So I think it's really cool that half of the U.S. Constitution was invented by the same people who invented Mohawks. Anyway, the Founding Fathers had these new ideas about how to set up a country. Instead of one person making all the decisions, everyone was going to get to make decisions. Then all those individual people can find ways to combine their good ideas and create things no one person could have thought of on their own. The country is never what any one person thinks it should be, but it keeps building up strength as people build upon each other's ideas. Now fast forward to 1917. By this point, capitalism had moved past its idealism stage, and a lot of people had seen its practical stage. A lot of people realized that political self-determination through economic self-determination didn't mean political self-determination for everyone. Some people's political self-determination was shutting out other people's self-determination. The leaders of the Russian Revolution realized that capitalists from other countries were buying assets in Russia. That meant decision-making power over some things in Russia was being given away to people who weren't even Russians. Russia in 1917 was in much the same situation as South America was in the 1950s. I've lived in South America. You try walking down the street of a South American city with long messy hair, a scraggly beard, and a black beret, and you'll be amazed by how many friends you'll make. I left my beret at home. A lot of people realized their resources and therefore economic decision-making power and therefore political decision-making power were being taken out of the country by people much more powerful than them. If they wanted that to stop, they were going to have to pool their resources and cooperate to struggle against the capitalists. That has been the foundation of the global struggle against capitalism from the beginning and still is today. On the one side, you have people who have enough decision-making power individually to pursue their individual self-interest and win at it. On the other side, you have people who realize they're losing to those people, so they better unite to try to protect themselves from the external threat, just like people unite for mutual protection whenever they perceive external threats. So, we're looking for a stable political system. Tribalism was a stable political system which endured from whatever point in the evolution of human intelligence it began up until a few thousand years ago in some parts of the world and up until the present in some parts of the world. In the past few thousand years, we've had a succession of political systems that were all tribalism applied to some situation, and all of them have broken down eventually. So, what's going wrong? What factors kept tribal political systems stable that have since been lost? The four basic problems are division of labor, public scientific illiteracy, and the insulation of the ruling class from the effects of their decisions and from other people. Division of labor I've talked about already. Political leadership is a specialized skill. Everyone can major in political science, but most people don't. So most people in the U.S. have a very low understanding of what politicians are doing. Public scientific illiteracy I've also talked about. Most people in the U.S. also have a very low understanding of what politicians should be doing. A scientifically illiterate public is a public that can be convinced to vote for politicians who make promises that defy scientific laws. As for insulation of the ruling class from the effects of their actions, there's a pretty simple test to see how serious factory owners who dump their wastes into a river are about neutralizing the toxicity of their wastes. Are they willing to take all their drinking water from downstream of their own factory? If not, why do they expect anyone else to drink it? That leads right to the insulation of the ruling class from the effects of their actions have on other people. As a lot of conservatives love to say, the Second Amendment makes all your other rights possible. Back in the days when the Constitution was written, when every man could buy a musket, and the military were armed with muskets, that was probably true. But today, the Second Amendment doesn't create the same balance of power between citizens and the government, because things would have to get much, much worse before citizens would be willing to resort to armed revolution against the mightiest military power on earth. And all the conservatives who own most of the guns and assume they could win their revolution because they have the creator of the universe on their side generally don't believe in evolution. So how would their revolution create a new political system whose ideas would be more consistent with reality anyway? In a lot of other democracies, they have a vote of no confidence so that citizens can remove government officials from office directly without resorting to armed revolution. That would be an improvement in some ways, but it still doesn't solve the problem that the Americans who would be removing the government officials from office still don't have the basic science literacy to create a political system that's consistent with reality. 75% of voters not believing in evolution would be enough to win a vote of no confidence. In a democracy where government officials are effectively held accountable to the citizens, the actions a government official can take are limited by the voters' beliefs about the world. Tribal governments solved these problems not because they anticipated them, but because these factors stabilized each other in a pattern that endured for most of the lifespan of our species. At a Stone Age technological level, people reach the end of their ability to increase their decision-making power over their surroundings sooner than do people who have metal tools. This experiment was done in the Americas. As Jared Diamond, a biologist, shows in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, the differences in technological levels between Europe and the pre-colonial Americas was the result of differences in resources in each part of the world. In the Americas, the only large animals that were available to domesticate for draft animals were the llamas in the mountains of Peru. The Europeans had horses, donkeys, and oxen. Some groups of Native Americans developed agriculture, and it spread to much of the Americas, and where it did, the people started making the same transition away from their original tribal political structure as everyone else did. But a person who can hitch up a team of horses can apply a lot more muscle power to things like plowing fields than can people who have to do all the work with their own hands. So that meant more division of labor, because in Europe, horses could do some of the work that people were doing elsewhere. Some Native Americans also began working metal by turning copper and gold into jewelry and arrowheads, but they just didn't have the combination of resources the Europeans had that it took to get to mining ore and refining it to turn it into the foundation of their technological level. This means that the Native Americans and Europeans had two different situations as far as perceiving their ability to increase their decision-making power through innovation in their tools. When you make all your tools out of stone and provide all the muscle power in human-sized units, And you don't see any way to improve upon either of those because the necessary materials have never been available in your surroundings. You eventually reach a point of diminishing returns. People can still think of new tools they could create and improvements they could make on existing tools, but they aren't going to be as big of improvements. It will take more and more innovation to produce smaller and smaller results. Meanwhile, the Europeans didn't see an end to their ability to increase their decision-making power through technological innovation. They just kept thinking of more and more things they could make out of metal and kept increasing their ability to affect their surroundings. By the time the population of Europe reached the carrying capacity of its environment, and a lot of people started dying in plagues and famines, Europeans had developed technology they could use to spread to other parts of the world. Before they figured out how to adapt to the limitations of their environment, they figured out how to increase the size of their environment. They focused their thoughts on simplistic solutions to their problems by finding more and more powerful ways to do the same kinds of things they were already doing. Well, the Native Americans were thinking about stuff this whole time too. They were attempting to improve their living conditions just like the Europeans. When they reached the physical limits of their technological innovation, they started looking for new ways to use the technology they had. So they figured out things like how to spread their populations out over their areas so they wouldn't deplete their resources. Everyone who figures that out figures it out by trial and error. They matched their level of understanding of their environment to the effects they were having on their environments in the situation they were in, so they were able to decide to live sustainably. I've heard this basic story from a number of Native Americans from different nations. Dr. Diamond tells the same story in his book Collapse, about how the indigenous people of various Pacific islands either succeeded or failed at figuring out the trick of sustainability. On the island of Tikopia, the people figured it out over time, although they made mistakes and caused some minor catastrophes. But they learned their lessons and solved their problems, and today they have inhabited their 2-square-mile island continuously for 3,000 years. They figured out how to divide up the land for farming and integrate their crops and limit their population size. On Easter Island, the people completely failed at making a transition to sustainability, and their civilization was wiped out by an environmental disaster they created. They overhunted and overlogged their island until they had nothing left to build boats out of to go fishing in, and no animals left to eat. They resorted to cannibalism, and 80% of their population got wiped out before their environmental impact stabilized. A solution to the environmental crisis depends on a level of public science literacy that's only being pioneered now. E.O. Wilson's book Consilience is about the need for a new renaissance in science, in which all fields of science will be unified by first principles, and then unified to all other areas of study by scientific first principles. There's a saying that science is a process by which this generation's idiots learned the discoveries of the last generation's geniuses. Just imagine if, in 100 years from now, high school janitors had today's equivalent of a PhD in environmental science, what that would do to the level of scientific competence we would expect from our political leaders. That solves the problem of citizens having the same basic understanding of the world as their government officials. The experiment in moving from capitalism to my definition of tribalism has already been done in reverse in the U.S. hundreds of times. One of my cousins explained to me how it was done to the Yurok Nation. Right here in Phoenix, Adrian Hendricks, a historian of the O'odham Nation, has a lecture called Colonization to Decolonization, in which he tells how it was done to his people, and it's the exact same story. First, the U.S. defeated the Native American nations militarily. Then they moved them on to the reservations. Then they used the laws of the reservation system to teach them to be capitalists, which would be a very positive thing for the white people to do if, in fact, capitalism was the solution to everything. In reality, though, the indigenous people had put a lot of thought into how to live with the resources they had on the land they had, and their cultures had developed accordingly. Getting these people to adopt capitalism now depended on destroying thousands of years of their cultural development. To say that competition drives economic development presupposes that a certain level of distrust is supposed to exist between people. It is true that people competing to control resources in whatever way they see fit increases the conversion of natural resources into finished products. If you and I both see a forest growing nearby and neither of us trusts the other, neither of us is going to trust what the other person is going to do if they take control of the forest and use its resources to increase their decision-making power. So I have to try to take control of the forest before you do in order to keep you from using it against me. But what if we don't distrust each other that much? What if we both trust that the other person will leave the forest alone, so neither one of us has to take control of it and convert it into some sort of finished products we can use? Then the forest will stay right where it is, converting carbon dioxide back into oxygen. That level of trust is what the thousands of years of intellectual work by indigenous people had built up to, and that's what the white people had to destroy before they could force indigenous people to start converting resources into finished products as fast as they could. Noam Chomsky, in his book Profit Over People, tells the same story about how capitalism was first forced on English peasants 350 years ago, by landowners passing laws that changed how peasants would have to use resources in the short term so that the peasants could no longer trust each other to stick to their long-term plans in how to use their resources. Every 4 years, in January, when someone takes the oath of office for the next term of the presidency, a lot of politicians remind us that the United States is a country of laws. But that's not true. Every January, we observe Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday as a national holiday. He didn't become such a hero by obeying the law. He became such a hero by breaking the law. Most people in the U.S. today agree that our country is a better place because he did. A lot of rich people are obsessed with the idea that the market is the foundation of society. The market certainly is the foundation of rich people's income, but that's just another example of people confusing life as they understand it with the world as a whole. These people act like sensible people invest their money in the stock market, and if everyone would do that, then everyone would be rich, so it's our own fault for not being rich like them. Oh yeah? Well, what are we supposed to do? What happens when we all go to the grocery store with our millions and millions of dollars and nobody can get any food because nobody works at the grocery store anymore? Capitalism has run into a number of problems here. First, economic power, and therefore decision-making power, is accruing to people who are the best at accruing economic power. That says absolutely nothing about their talents and skills at environmental science or in any other field. So political power is ending up in the hands of people who don't know how to make political decisions that are consistent with environmental sustainability. Second, some sort of let the buyer beware approach to environmental sustainability is no solution because we don't have the level of public science literacy to make that work, and we can't learn it by trial and error. Global environmental disaster, or even multiple regional environmental disasters, will be big singular events, and they will inflict huge amounts of harm or death on millions or billions of people. Hurricane Katrina, for example, turned fully 1% of the population of the United States into environmental refugees within a couple of days. Third, the financial economic system doesn't recognize the value of a thing until that thing has the potential to be controlled by someone. Controlling a thing means exercising effective decision-making power over how the thing will be used. Converting the thing from its raw material state to a finished product that is valuable to you means making the thing do something other than whatever it was doing before. What the thing was doing before was playing a critical role in the environment. If you and I trust each other enough to agree to leave a forest where it is, the forest will go right on playing its environmental functions, but no money will change hands. In order to assign a dollar value to the forest, I have to be able to decide what will happen to it and to prevent you from deciding what will happen to it. But now that I can do that, I have the choice to cut down the forest and turn it into patio furniture. My decision will be based on what I perceive the best use of the forest to be. If I don't believe in global warming, then it doesn't matter how big of a problem you believe it is. My right to economic self-determination has precluded your right to vote for a healthy atmosphere. According to the founding principle of capitalism, that individuals should have the right to control resources in whatever way they see fit, the smartest choice would be to buy up forests, plan on cutting them down, and then demand that governments pay you the annual income you would have made from the shopping mall you could have built there. That money would be taken from the taxes people pay. At that point, we would be forced to pay taxes to be saved from an environmental disaster. At that point, the environmental crisis would become an environmental hostage crisis. Fourth, the assumption that increased economic activity, meaning the increased conversion of raw materials into finished products, will forever be beneficial to us, presupposes an infinite supply of natural resources. The Earth is so much bigger than any one of us that it does effectively contain an infinite supply of resources as far as any one person is concerned, because there's no way any one of us could use up all the resources on Earth in one lifetime. But there is also a number of people in the world that doesn't compare to anything within anyone's realm of personal experience. There are 6.8 billion people in the world, and no one has ever met anything similar to that number. So intuition is no guide to the effects we're having on the environment. Capitalism was conceived about 200 years before the laws of thermodynamics were discovered, so people had no way of using that to recognize that the Earth's resources were finite. Even though Ferdinand Magellan had already sailed around the world, infinite natural resources could still exist on a finite planet if there was no limit to their rate of production. That's what the laws of thermodynamics disproved. Global environmental unsustainability was discovered in 1968. It was discovered by Paul Ehrlich, a biologist, and independently by a group of scientists and mathematicians called the Club of Rome. Dr. Ehrlich's first book about it was called The Population Bomb, and the Club of Rome's first book was called The Limits to Growth. They could see that we were already far into a problem. The basic discovery was that people had made a lot of economic plans that presupposed an effectively unlimited supply of resources. But when the scientists did the math to compare our rates of usage of resources to our supplies of resources, they found that we would run out of natural resources in the 21st century. So that posed huge questions about what we should do. These pioneers of global environmental science have been trying to warn people about this problem ever since they discovered it. The real foundation of a society is the network of trust that develops among a group of people. The better the people trust each other, the more powerful their society is. The less they trust each other, the weaker their society is. The degree to which you and I trust each other depends on the degree to which we share a worldview. The better I understand the ideas you use to make your decisions, the better I can anticipate your decisions, so the better I can coordinate my efforts with yours. Without a network of trust, you don't have a market because people don't trade with people they don't trust. Or more specifically, the degree to which people are willing to trade with each other is limited by the degree to which they believe they will get a fair deal. Without a network of trust, you don't have a government either. People who don't trust each other don't agree on a set of laws to live by. Or rather, the degree to which people are willing to formalize a plan for how to coordinate their activity is limited by their trust for each other. This brings me at last to the critical distinction among capitalism, socialism, and my definition of tribalism. When a species moves into a new environment and it thrives there, its life cycle passes through two stages. First is called the colonization phase. The species multiplies until its population size is limited by predators, disease, or food availability. Then the species transitions to its sustainability phase. If a population size was limited by food availability, it means the species finds a large supply of food at first, reproduces until it eats up all the food, and then most of the species dies in a famine until its numbers balance out against the food production of the environment. The discovery of the environmental crisis was the discovery that humanity was nearing the end of its colonization phase. The environmental crisis is the transition from our colonization phase to our sustainability phase. The idea that people should use their resources in whatever way they see fit is the definition of any species' economic relationship to the environment during its colonization phase. Evolution depends on survival and reproduction, so The organisms use up whatever resources they can get, survive and reproduce as well as possible that way, and then a few of them survive the famine. That's survival of the fittest all the way for a species that can't figure out how to limit its own environmental impact. Among humans who each perceived an effectively infinite supply of resources in the world, individuals using resources in whatever way they saw fit was how people survived and reproduced. If you just hang out and leave forests alone while I cut down the forests to build ships, forts, houses, barns, and weapons, I'm going to survive and reproduce, and I'm going to conquer you. But as people perceive an end to their supply of resources, they perceive a need to establish some other way of determining how resources will be used, which is what a lot of indigenous people did and what some socialists have tried to do. Those who have succeeded have stabilized their interactions with their environments and have stabilized their societies overall. A lot of capitalists insist that capitalism can be adapted to environmental sustainability. That is true in a sense, but only in the sense that sustainability depends on individuals deciding how best to use their resources, limited to whatever uses competent people determine to be consistent with the long-term benefits to their society. This proposes that individuals' rights to use their resources in whatever way they see fit should be limited by a more fundamental principle. When the principle of capital ceases to be the foundation of your economic system, and you adopt the founding principle that a lot of socialists and other people are already struggling for, in a much bigger sense, that isn't capitalism anymore. The term for that is market socialism. Some very insightful intellectual work has already been done around the precarious situation of the U.S. political system. Despite what a lot of people believe, making political systems break down is fairly easy. It might take a lot of effort, but conceptually it's no challenge at all. Stan Goff is a 20-year veteran of Army elite units, including the Special Forces. He spent his career making governments break down. He explains this in his book, Full Spectrum Disorder. A government, fundamentally, is a pattern of behavior among a group of people. All you have to do to destroy a government is to make the situation in the country change faster than the government can adapt to it. As individual people adapt their own patterns of behavior to the changing situation, they will cease to engage in the patterns of behavior known as government of country X. A government effectively ceases to exist when its laws cease to be enforced. Now this is where things get really interesting. According to Mr. Goff, the Army Special Forces and other elite units try to limit entrance to conservatives. They especially favor white men like him who grew up in the Bible Belt. They try really hard to shut black men out of the elite forces altogether by saying things like a lot of black people can't swim. Because what happened the last time a lot of black people got a lot of combat skills, but the Black Panthers came marching through the streets demanding more rights and feeling like they could win them. So this means that the people in the U.S. who have the most talent and skill for overthrowing governments are mainly Christian fundamentalists. If anyone overthrows our government, it's probably going to be Christian conservatives trying to keep the bleeding heart liberals from taking over. When you believe that you have been chosen by the almighty creator of the universe to carry out his plan, the fact that the U.S. has a government people are supposed to vote for doesn't really mean anything to you. Or something else that could make the situation in the U.S. change faster than the government could adapt to it would be a huge environmental disaster. What if 100 Katrina-sized disasters hit the United States all in 1 year? Would we have any effective government left? We'd probably still have the president hiding in a bunker issuing orders to the military and declaring martial law to try to maintain order in some parts of the country. But even so, that wouldn't be the government we voted for. What we need isn't ideology. What we need is leadership. A solution to the problem of public scientific illiteracy is what I could call the scientific ninja movement. The definition of education, which you learn in instructor certification training, like I did, is the act of making the student's mental model of the world more closely correspond to reality. Education is not the attempt to teach students things. If students aren't learning, education is not taking place. We all start out learning the same ideas to a point, like math and reading, but when simple ideas start building all the way up to big philosophical ideas, the people who already agree with those philosophical ideas are the ones who can still understand what their teachers are talking about, and people whose ideas don't match the philosophy stop listening. If you're serious about teaching people complicated stuff, you have to start by listening to what they talk about and think about to see how they fit their ideas together so far. Every culture has an underlying philosophy. Those are the connections among ideas that people start with, so those are the ideas you have to start with to get them over to the ideas you're trying to teach them. For instance, in Barack Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, he tells how very few Black and Hispanic students major in science or engineering in college. When I read that, I couldn't believe it. Evolutionary psychology is a science. It's a new field of science, but it's being pioneered by scientific geniuses who have college educations. So, ever since I read that book, I've wondered, which part of evolutionary psychology exactly can college professors not get Black people to understand? Can college professors not figure out how to get people from the inner cities to believe in the law of the jungle? Can they not figure out how to get African Americans to believe their ancestors came from Africa? Can they not figure out how to get Black people to believe there is no race of people who was born superior or inferior to any other, which was the whole point of the civil rights movement? All of those ideas are big obstacles to getting a lot of white people to believe in human evolution. But if you're trying to win support for ideas, the best place to start is with people who are the most receptive to the ideas. So, is this really a failure of Black people's education? Or is it a failure of college professors' education? The whole idea behind the racialization of our economic system was that white people didn't want to deal with certain aspects of life, so they designated other people to have to do those parts of life. Now we still have something similar. The whole point of going to college and learning how to earn a middle-class income is to get the choice in which parts of life you want to deal with and which parts you want to leave up to someone else. Personally, I'm baffled how scientific geniuses who get college degrees in biology think they can study life objectively and simultaneously eliminate certain aspects of life from their realm of personal experience. A lot of Black people I've known have learned not to trust white people who wear expensive clothes and claim to know important stuff about life nobody else knows. But that ain't a hard problem to solve. Ride city buses and get a job working in a warehouse where Black people listen to rap stations all day long. That's what I did. Rap is a huge body of ideas about life and death. There's no shortage of people in the U.S. who have devoted a lot of thought to what it is about people that has made the world turn out the way it has. So, if you're looking for support for new ideas, start by looking for which groups of people already have similar ideas and then get down with some anthropology. Now the last step. How do you get from being a science philosophy ninja to being a leader in the universal political system? You have to be the kind of person other people want to cooperate with and learn from. You earn your way up to being a tribal chief by being a hero. Think of any movie you've seen where heroes battle against villains. How do those movies always start? First, there are a bunch of people minding their own business. In other words, the interactions among the people creates a stable social environment. Then some villains find a way to benefit themselves by taking advantage of the predictable patterns of behavior of the other people. The villains do things that are possible in the social environment, but that nobody else had thought of before. That's harmful to the group as a whole because it throws it out of balance and destabilizes it. The total harm to the other people is greater than the benefit to the villains, but the villains don't care. That's what makes them villains. Then the heroes show up. The heroes believe they can stop the villains if they take some big risks, and they feel they should. The sacrifices the heroes make and the chances they take are great, but the results mostly benefit other people. But the heroes believe it's worth it. By defeating the villains, they restabilize their social environment. Then what happens? The majority of the people involved, the innocent bystanders, tell the stories of the heroes and hold them up as their role models. They try to learn from them, and they teach their children about them, and they try to follow their examples to find better ways to keep their social environment stable in the future. If everyone taught their children to grow up to be villains, society would self-destruct. Thanks to the discoveries biologists have made in reciprocal altruism in social environments, now we can recognize that every story of battles between good and evil, and between heroes and villains more specifically, is an idea about reciprocal altruism as the foundation of society. In a stable society, individuals, each pursuing their self-interest, balances out. When someone's pursuit of self-interest throws the society way out of balance, someone has to do whatever it takes to stop them and restore the balance. A strong society gets its strength through diversity and practicality. So, what does science tell us about what we should do? Long-term success at your goals depends on adaptability. I've been talking about strength through diversity, practicality, and adaptability for probably 8 or 9 hours now. I keep writing these lectures that go on and on and on and on, grinding ideas right down to powder. And when I get to the end, I usually realize that someone else has already said the same thing in much fewer words. As Ani DeFranco put it in her song Buildings and Bridges are made to bend in the wind. To withstand the world, that's what it takes. All that steel and stone are no match for the air, my friend. What doesn't bend, breaks. Thanks for coming out.